you have your Bible with you this morning, open to the book of Ruth. Put your bookmark there. We will look at most of that story this morning, so I hope that you'll turn there and be prepared. I recognize that it's still January, but our meeting is going to be next weekend, and so I'm going to go ahead and introduce the February theme today, so we're not doing it halfway through February. So that's the point of our discussion this morning. Good to see all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all your kind comments this morning. The name is Papa. You know, Abraham was Abram until God pulled him aside and said, "You're going to be the father of many nations." Now it's Abraham. Okay? If you're not going to call me Russ, call me Papa. Not Peepaw, Grandpa, Grand, you know, none of all this other stuff. Or I'm going to start calling you by a different name. Okay? So just fair warning. It is Papa and Mimi. But I do have to acknowledge this. I did not become a grandfather for the first time yesterday. 18 years ago, when Galen and Nadine were having Baylor, I went by the hospital to check on them just about the time that Baylor was actually born. And so I walked in, and you just don't want to walk in right then, so I walked right back out. And I'm standing in the hall, and a nurse comes by, and of course there's nurses in and out, you know how that goes. And she comes by, and she looks at me, and she smiled and said, "Congratulations, Grandpa." And I said, "No, I'm not the granddad. I'm just the preacher. Just came by to check on him." About 5 minutes later, another nurse comes buzzing by, and she stops and looks over and says, "Grandpa, congratulations." And I was kind to her, and you know, I said, "No, I'm just..." The third one that came by and said, "Hey, Grandpa," she spent the rest of the day in ICU. But we've had a running joke ever since then that Baylor actually made me a granddaddy the first time. So, but thank you for all your prayers. Haley will be in the hospital till tomorrow morning, Lord willing, maybe this evening, and they are all doing well, and y'all have been wonderful in that regard, and we can't thank you enough, and I'm sure Tracy will have 400 gazillion pictures to show you when she gets back home. I've got a few that I'll be glad to show you after services. So, this theme that we've been doing the last year and a half, a little over a year, excuse me, my head's bleeding, I don't know why. I started to crawl up on the podium because I figure once you become a granddad, you have to start using the handrails. This theme that we've been following for the last year or so presents some challenges with some people. You can look at a lot of Bible characters and their place in the story and their character and their activities really speak for themselves, and it's not really a big challenge to find things to say about them. But then there are other characters, and we've tried this year to choose a couple of characters that maybe weren't quite so obvious in their impact. And there is a danger when you study Bible characters that might be considered the minor players. I hesitate to say it that way, but kind of in the way that we look at it. You've got people that are exceptionally significant to the storyline, and then you've got the people that are just kind of in the periphery. In some ways, Ruth is kind of that way. It is very likely that the story of Ruth is here predominantly because she was going to become the great-grandmother to David. And David is exceptionally significant as a storyline and to understanding our redemption. And so it may well be that the reason we had this little story about Ruth is because Ruth is going to become the matriarch in ways to this great king. There is also the possibility, if you look at chapter 1, you'll notice the very first thing that we are told is that this story takes place when the judges were in the land. And for those of you who just came out of the Judges class, one of the things that happens as you study Judges is that you learn about some of these deliverers of God, but what you also see is that God's people really became very corrupted in those several centuries where we learn about the judges. And when you get to the end, you've got a couple of really terrible stories that kind of offer a glimpse, I think, into the corruption of God's people in that day. Ruth may be where it is because the story of Ruth is a story of people who are exceptionally faithful. And in many ways, they stand in contrast to what was going on in Judges. But other than those two things, I must tell you that sometimes it's a bit of a challenge to try to figure out what would she say to us. When Paul sends Timothy to Ephesus in 1 Timothy chapter 1, one of the first things he tells him is, I want you to go there because there are teachers there who are not helping our situation. They are giving themselves to what he calls endless genealogies and fables. And from what I understand about Jewish culture, they were really good at taking some of these heroes in the Bible and building whole stories around them as a part of their verbal tradition, their oral tradition. And so I want to be careful not to say things that are not in evidence, and so that makes for a bit of a challenge. Okay, so the question that we're entertaining is, what would she say to us if she could stand before us today? What do we learn? What is it that God has in mind as he tells us about people like Ruth or Esther or Hagar, some of these women that are a little more peripheral to the Bible story? And so let me offer a couple of observations to you from this story. The story is in itself fairly simple. There's a man and a woman named Elimelech and his wife Naomi who have two sons. They live in Bethlehem, what we think of as Bethlehem where Jesus is born, Bethlehem Ephrath. And there is a famine in the land in the time of the Judges, so they go to Moab. They move across the Jordan River where they feel like they can make a living and survive. And while they are there, Naomi and Elimelech's two sons marry Moabite girls. And over the course of 10 years, Naomi's husband and her two sons die. So they leave Naomi. That leaves Naomi with her two daughters-in-law, both of whom are Moabites. I don't know how long of the 10 years that they lived together, but when things get better in Israel, Naomi is determined to go home. And so she encourages these two young Moabite women to go back to their homes. Basically what she says is, I'm too old to have sons. If I had them today, you wouldn't wait for them to grow up in order for them to become your husbands. If you go back home now, you can make a life for yourself. And one of the girls, Orpah, she does. She turns and goes home. But Ruth, the other young woman, she is bound and determined that she is going to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Even when Naomi says, look, your sister-in-law, she's gone back to her family, she's gone back to her gods. One of the more famous sections in Ruth begins in verse 16 of chapter 1. Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so she accompanies Naomi back to Bethlehem. They get there during the harvest time. Ruth, the daughter-in-law, goes out into the fields in order to provide a living for her mother-in-law. And so she is gleaning among the sheaves. Anything that dropped when they were reaping the harvest, they were to leave in the field. That was what the law of Moses told them to do for those who were poor so that they could have something to eat. And so Ruth goes into the field and she is picking up the scraps from the barley harvest. And as she is there, the owner of the field she's working in, who is named Boaz, comes along, asks about who she is. When she is identified by his workers, he tells her, I know who you are, I appreciate what you're doing with your mother-in-law, you stay in my field, you work among my people, and basically extends hospitality to her, even going so far as telling his workers, let some extra fall so that she can pick it up. And so he is helping Ruth, and he is helping Naomi. And she goes back home that day, and she tells Naomi where she's working, and Naomi says, Boaz is a close relative of ours. And you can see the wheels turning, actually, in Naomi's head. And as chapter 3 begins, she says, should I not seek a place for you. Because Boaz could stand in the place of a redeemer. In other words, as a near relative to a widow girl, he could marry her and raise up offspring with her who would then inherit the original family land. And so she tells Ruth in chapter 3 to go to the place of winnowing and to go in the middle of the evening after everybody's gone to bed and slide up under Boaz's feet at the foot of his bed, and he'll tell you what to do. And so, sure enough, Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night, sees her there. Who are you? What are you doing here? And she said, I am Ruth, your maidservant. I want you to perform the levirate duty to me. I want you to be a redeemer to me. And he blesses her and sends her away before the morning comes with a gift and basically says there's a closer relative, but if he won't do it, I will. And the next morning goes, finds the closer relative, approaches him about the circumstance. The closer relative wants the land, but not the girl. And so Boaz then takes Ruth and has a child with her, marries her, has a child with her, raises up offspring to the original owner of the land, and that offspring happens to be the grandfather to David. Okay. What in the world does God want me to get from this? Well, let me make a couple suggestions. I'll try to be brief. I've got 4 and I've already taken 10 minutes, so here we go. What do we learn from Ruth? And I would encourage you, if you've never read it, go back and read the story, because I gave you the Reader's Digest version. The first thing that I am impressed with, and I think she would say to us, is you need to be really loyal to your people, to your family. One of the most impressive things about Ruth is her devotion to Naomi. I read for you from chapter 1, if you flip back there in verse 16. This is always a bit of an ironic thing to me. There is a wedding song that was very popular when I was young, and it uses these words to talk about husband and wife. My people will be your people. I remember the first time I realized that this was Naomi, Ruth saying this to her mother-in-law, and it completely ruined it for me. It's not a wedding song. This is an expression of devotion. And you see it throughout the entirety of this particular account. She won't go back to her own family. She won't go back to her own gods. In chapter 2, she is going out to provide a living for this woman who she really actually has no blood relation to whatsoever. She goes out and she works all day after getting permission. She stops for a little bit, and when she is offered lunch along with the workers, she saves some of it, takes it back to Naomi. Through the whole story, what you see in Ruth is a woman who is completely devoted to a family member. She sacrifices her time, she sacrifices opportunities for her own circumstance. She gives her concern, she gives her devotion, she provides for her, she cares for her. She is utterly and completely selfless. In fact, in chapter 2, when Boaz meets her, he says in verse 11, "It has been fully reported to me all you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you've left your father and your mother in the land of your birth, and come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work." This is impressive enough with a relative. It is the more impressive when it is a woman and her mother-in-law. Infamously, that's not the greatest relationship that people have. What do we get from this? Well, I think Ruth is this wonderful example of the way people are supposed to be in regards to their family. And we're living in a day and age where this is a lost art, folks. It's a lost art actually in a lot of ways. God has always been concerned about how we care for people who are in need, and particularly when those people are a part of our family. In Exodus chapter 20, you have God making arrangements in regards to honoring father and mother. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 15 helps us to understand that's not just an attitude, but an action. When God tells us honor father and mother, and you younger people who are still at home, or maybe you're newly married, you're starting your family, you need to understand this. As your parents age, they become as much responsibility to you as you were to them when they had you. Does that make sense to you? In Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 5, we're told that those who will not take care of their family are worse than infidels in the eyes of God. And you see this borne out in a lot of ways, whether it is God's instructions in regards to husband and wife, father and mother, or even God's instructions in regards to husband and wife. I tell you, divorce, this failure to honor the vows of marriage is every bit a family travesty as children who won't take care of their parents or parents who won't take care of their children. And God gives a lot of laws in Exodus, in Isaiah chapter 1, in 1 Timothy chapter 5, in James chapter 1. Gives a lot of laws about people who are divorced from family relationships, about widows and about orphans and about children and about parents. And I tell you, in a day and age where people just discount that stuff, we need to be conscious of it. We're the people of God. Our perspective is not, well, the easy thing is just to move on and find another wife or another husband. We're the people of God. What God joined together, let not man put asunder. And a failure to appreciate the importance of that relationship is a failure on a lot of fronts, because that filters down, folks. You know, I grew up in an age among people who were affiliated with Churches of Christ, where there was a lot of argument and division about human institutions. And the most emotional of those arguments had to do with orphans' homes. And I've heard all my life, well, you know, I actually had somebody ask me, how in the world do you think God expects me to fulfill the command to take care of orphans and widows if the church is not sending money to an orphanage? Well, I'm going to tell you how God expects us to do that. He expects us to do that as individuals. Because what widows need is not just some building where they can eat and sleep and have some shelter. Look at nursing homes in our day and age where so many people just absolutely desert their loved ones. Are those people getting the family attention that they need, that make them feel like they're a part of caring and loving people? I'm going to tell you, if all you're getting is institutional care, now I understand there are times that becomes a necessity in regards to medicinal and physical help, but don't put your parent in a home and then desert them. And the same is true in regards to the whole big problem with orphans' homes. I'm going to tell you what orphans need. And I would go so far as to say this is what stepchildren need. Because it's hard to raise children that are not your own. They need a family that can show them God. What they don't need is just food and clothing. And so when God tells us that He's concerned about the orphans and the widows, when we are to take care of our parents and honor them, when we are to bring our children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, when we are to honor our covenants with our family, it is because family is important to God, because that's where people learn about God. And I think Ruth would tell us, you need to pay attention to your family. And I could spend the rest of the time making the spiritual application of that to our relationship with brethren in the church, but I'll leave it at that. Number two, I think Ruth would tell us that we need to be wise about how we go about our living. And I would offer this especially to our younger folks, although this is not an issue that is particular or absolutely limited to the youth. One of the things you see about Ruth in this story is Ruth is characterized by wisdom, by discretion. The things that she does are done very intentionally and with forethought. Whether you want to talk about her care for Naomi, if you go to chapter 2, you'll notice in verse 6 that she doesn't just go out to the field, she goes to the foreman of the workers and makes a request. Verse 6, when Boaz asks who it is, the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, "It's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She came and said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among sheaves. She didn't just assume that place. She went properly through the channels and made requests. And her interaction with Boaz on this occasion, Boaz comes to her, he offers her kindness. Her response to him is characterized by humility. Let me find favor in your sight, O Lord. You've comforted me. You've spoken kindly to your maidservant, even though I'm not like one of your maidservants. She is a woman who is considerate. And when she goes to Boaz later in chapter 4, she approaches him in such a way, and this is, I think, partly Naomi's doing and partly her doing. She approaches him in such a way as to remove any potential embarrassment. She doesn't go to him in the middle of the day, in the middle of town, and go, hey, you're my near kinsman. You need to raise children by me so that my family can have their proper land. She doesn't do that. She goes at night when nobody can see. They have this exchange. He could have easily said, no, I'm not going to do that. Nobody would have been the wiser, but that's not the way she does it. And before it's all over, he encourages her, look, you need to leave before the daylight so that nobody sees you're coming and going, so that nobody thinks that there is anything improper going on. And her entire life is characterized by that kind of attention to propriety. Because, folks, the appearance of wickedness can be just as deadly in influence as the wickedness itself. Turn over to the book of Proverbs, if you would, right quick. And I would especially ask you younger folks to turn over. Proverbs chapter 4. Now, I want you to appreciate that wisdom in life is a step beyond just obedience. Obedience can be blind. Obedience can say nothing about the heart. Obedience can be rote. Well, I'm going to do what God says because God said to do it, but I'm not going to give it any more thought than that. I'm going to tell you, a mature disciple obeys God with an intent. Our obedience, it has something to say about our character. It has something to do with our influence. It has something to do with our honoring our God. Proverbs chapter 4, I wish we had the time to do the whole chapter. But the whole chapter basically says, verse 2, I give you good doctrine, don't forsake my law. Verse 4, let your heart retain my words, keep my commandments. Verse 5, get wisdom and get understanding. And as the chapter goes along, basically Solomon paints the picture, especially verse 14, of two different roads you can go down. Here's an intersection with two paths that you can follow. Don't enter the path of the wicked or walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, don't travel on it, turn from it, pass away from it. Verse 18, the path of the just is a shining sun, shines ever brighter unto the perfect way. The way of the wicked is like darkness, they don't know what makes them stumble. Give attention to my words. Now listen very carefully. Verse 23, keep your heart with all diligence. Pay attention to your mind. Listen to me. Pay attention to your mind. Pay attention to what goes in. Pay attention to what comes out. Guard it, he says, with all diligence, because the decisions that you make, the wisdom or the folly that you show in your life is going to come based upon whether or not you used your head. Verse 23, verse 24. Put away from you a deceitful mouth and put perverse lips far from you. You can be dishonest with everybody else, but God knows, and sooner or later, dishonesty is going to come out. It's going to be obvious in your decisions. If they are foolish instead of wise, don't fool yourself. Verse 25, let your eyes look straight ahead and your eyelids look right before you. Ponder the path of your feet. I wish if I could get every kid, about the time that they start pre-adolescence, to stop and learn to think about what you're doing before you do it. That's one of the great challenges of the teenage years. Because immaturity in mental capacity, it doesn't stop and think, it just does. I had a roommate in college, had a big scar under his chin. I said, Mason, how'd you get that scar under your chin? He said, we were kicking around one day after school, and We had a bet that I could jump over a Volkswagen. And I made it to the bumper. And that's what happened right there. And who's tempted to jump over a Volkswagen? And whose thought was that? I mean, who thought, hey, this would be a good idea? Let's eat Tide Pods. You know, let's take a tablespoonful of cinnamon, which can absolutely choke you to death, and let's see who can swallow that without any liquid whatsoever. Now, I'm going to tell you what all that is. It's funny and it makes for entertaining videos on YouTube, but it is stupid. And if you haven't learned at an early age to think through stuff, because I don't care if you can swallow cinnamon. Do you really believe that in 20 years you're going to walk up to your high school reunion and this guy's going to be a successful engineer and this woman over here is this wonderful teacher and your claim to fame is, I could swallow cinnamon? Ruth is a woman who manifests a lot of wisdom and discretion in the decisions she makes and the way she deals with people. And can I please suggest to you, learn to think, ponder the path of your feet, let your eyes look straight ahead, and then don't turn to the right or to the left. And let me say this, there's a lot of adults that haven't learned this lesson yet either. So I think Ruth would tell us, look, you need to learn to be wise. Now, number 3, I think Ruth would tell us to have some confidence in the way that God does things. We touched on this a little bit, or I touched on it a little bit Wednesday night. It is interesting to me as you start reading carefully through Ruth that I think it becomes somewhat clear that Ruth doesn't just give herself to Naomi, but she gives herself to the way that Naomi was living her life. She gives herself to God's ways. In chapter 1, when Ruth is trying to send these girls home, notice if you would, when Naomi's trying to send them home, notice if you would in verse 13 of chapter 1. And she's asking, would you wait till I had sons again for them to grow up? She said, no, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Verse 15, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her gods and her people. And yet Ruth's reply to that is, your people will be my God, people, your God will be my God, and may Jehovah do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me and you. Even though Naomi, when she goes back home and gets to Bethlehem and everybody's excited to see her, what she says is, God's been against me, my life has been terrible, I have had everything taken away, and yet Ruth does not share that view of God. When Boaz meets her, Boaz commends the kind of life that she's living and makes the observation in chapter 2 and verse 12, the Lord repay your work and give you a full reward by God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. And when Naomi then suggests that, look, if you'll marry this guy over here, because this is the way that God set this up, then we can inherit the family land and you can be taken care of. And she does that. Women, if your mother-in-law came up and said, here's the guy I wish you would have married, how would that have gone? How would it have gone if you let somebody else choose your husband for you? Now, I want you to appreciate that's what Ruth is going through, so much so that when she has the discussion with Boaz in chapter 3, Boaz commends her. Look at chapter 3 and verse 10. Blessed are you of God, of Jehovah, my daughter. You've shown me more kindness at the end than at the beginning, in that you did not go after young men, whether poor or rich. Why does she go and ask Boaz to marry her? Because this is God's way of doing things. She's a Moabite. She's not an Israelite. The people in Israel are very corrupt, but she absolutely gives herself to the way that God would have her act in regards to God's laws. And that impresses me. It impresses me that she adopts a whole new way of living, which is what repentance is, which is what God asks all of us to do. That we would give ourselves to God's ways of doing things. That we be humble people, that we be kind people, that we be selfless people, that we be servants of one another, that we join ourselves to other of like precious faith, and that we work together to become more Christ-like, completely confident that if we will live our lives this way, it will be the best for everybody. And as the story plays out, appreciate her impact because she gave herself to God's ways. In Matthew chapter 1, we have the genealogy of Jesus. Devin mentioned this back when he was talking about Sarah and Hagar. And one of the interesting things about Matthew's genealogy is that there are 4 women that Matthew mentions in this genealogy. It's a genealogy that's being connected to Abraham, but God mentions 4 women. The 4 women are Tamar, who Judah took as his wife, who was, by best appearance, a Canaanite girl, who had been married to 2 of Judah's sons, and they had been wicked, and God had struck them dead, and Judah refused to give Tamar his youngest son, and she tricks Judah into having children to raise up as she was supposed to. So here's a woman who commits incest with her father-in-law, who's a part of the lineage of Jesus. The second one that we are introduced to is Rahab. You remember Rahab? Rahab lived in the city of Jericho, lived on the wall. She's identified as a harlot. And the spies that go into Jericho go to her house because it's not going to be any big deal to see 2 strangers go into a harlot's house. And she protects them, and she looks for deliverance from the destruction of Jericho through them. And she goes on to marry into the lineage of Jesus. And God mentions her. The third one is Ruth. She is a Moabite girl. She's not part of the lineage of Jesus in regards to her own background. She's a descendant of Abraham through Hagar and Ishmael. And yet, she becomes the great-grandmother to David. And the fourth one is Bathsheba, the adulteress. And it's interesting to me that God mentions those 4 women. You've got 3 women who are infamous for their sexual immorality. And the other was a Gentile. And I think what that says is when God came into the world, He was not naive about what the world's like and about the people that He came to save, and that everybody is included in God's efforts to bring redemption to mankind. It doesn't matter what you've done. You can be a part of the family of God. That's what I get from that. And you want to know how Ruth got there? She got there by living a life the way God told her to live. You don't know what could happen in your life, the people you could influence, the good that you can do, how things can come out years down the road. There is no way you can know the kind of impact that you can have. But I'm going to tell you this, if it's going to be an impact for God, it's going to be because you lived your life the way God would have you live it. And that brings me to the last observation, and that is this. Don't dismiss providence. There's no miracles in the story of Ruth, unless it be in chapter 4 when it says in verse 13, Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception. I don't know, she may have been a barren young woman. We really don't know. But other than that, there's nothing miraculous. She makes a decision to follow her mother-in-law back home because her husband has died, and her father-in-law died, and her brother-in-law died. So she's going to go back, but she's going to stick with the family. And she goes to a particular field, and it just happens to be the field of a relative. And she's working hard, and she takes note. The relative takes note. And the relative happens to be a single man. I don't know anything about Boaz other than that he was wealthy and apparently an older man. And before it's all said and done, because Naomi starts thinking, hey, he's a redeemer, and Boaz says, well, okay, well, yeah, I'll redeem him. Let's make sure we do it right. Let's make sure and check with this other guy first. And at first he wants the land, then he decides that he doesn't. And when the story's over, we've got David with no miracles. In the most unlikely way, I want you to understand something about God in this day and age where everybody is just absolutely fascinated and overwhelmed with what's mystical and what's eerie and what captures our imagination and what captures our emotion and what makes us just overwhelmed with curiosity. God can be God without doing miracles and still accomplish His will. You understand that? God doesn't have to put the Spirit in you and open doors and lead you down this hallway and make this decision or that decision for you in order that God's will might be accomplished in my life, your life, or in any other life, because He's God. He can use circumstances, He can use time and chance, He can see the future as if it is happening right now, and God can do things to accomplish His will without suspending the laws of nature. And in this day and age, that is important because God tells us to pray for things. We're told to pray for our daily bread. We're told to pray to be delivered from temptation. We're told to pray to be delivered from the evil one. We're told to pray for everything. Seek and you shall find. And I'm going to tell you, if we don't serve a God who can act, then prayer's worthless. When you pray to God, you need to have the confidence that God can take care of things. He'll either take care of the situation or He'll take care of you in the situation, one or the other. And that doesn't mean that you're going to wake up tomorrow and all the laws of nature are going to be suspended in order that God can answer your prayers. God doesn't need to do that. But He can answer prayer. He promises to answer prayer. Like a child comes to the father asking for an egg. He said, asking for bread. He's not going to give him a rock. This is not the God that we serve. Our God is a God who blesses. I don't know. It's not said, but it fills me with curiosity. And this is where you have to be careful about the fables and endless genealogies. You think Ruth ever prayed to God about her circumstance? You think Naomi prayed to God about that circumstance? I can't help but think that they did. And what you find is through a series of what we think of as just, that's just dumb luck. Well, in retrospect, I would argue that's the providence of God. And we need to have some confidence that God can work things through in our life. And so, we need to talk to Him. His eyes are open. His ears are open and His eyes are over the righteous. And so I think Ruth would tell us you have some confidence in the providence of God. You try to do things His way. You be wise in the decisions that you make and how you go about living your life. And you give yourself to your family. These are not hard things to understand. I'm not sure but what she would tell us some other things, but these are the things I think she might say. And the question is, just like all the rest of them have been, are we going to listen? It's an interesting little story. I'm not sure all the reasons that it's there, but those are some things I see. I hope they will help you, and I hope you think about that as we go through the month. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, we could help you. We invite your response. Probably stand and sing.